We want to welcome everyone on tonight. We're really excited to have you in this space. We've got some wonderful partners with us on tonight and some brilliant minds. And we're going to be our subject tonight in this Michigan People's Assembly. This is our first Michigan People's Assembly. And again, we want to welcome you into the space. And we're going to be tackling the issue of transforming prosecution and looking at that within Michigan and what that looks like and what that means. When we look at, we talk about, prosecution in Michigan, and we look kind of across our nation, we know that over 2 million of our US citizens are behind bars, and roughly a quarter of whom are simply awaiting trial, and over 11 million people cycling through prisons and jails every year. Millions more are under some form of state supervision, such as parole and probation. And so tonight we want to lean into this conversation on transforming prosecution in Michigan. And we know that prosecutors not only have the power to ruin lives, but they also have the power to repair damage in local communities and protect people from further harms caused by the criminal legal system. And as we've seen in a handful of places around the country, prosecutors who are committed to reforms can use their discretion to choose liberty over incarceration and rehabilitation over punishment. So we're going to dive deep on tonight into this discussion. And so again, we want to welcome you into the space to our first Michigan People's Assembly. And so in the comment section, we're going to ask you to just introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, and your community that you represent. And what would you like to know about prosecution? I am Mordecai. I will be your moderator for tonight. And so I'm really glad to be in this space again. And so again, fill up the comment section, name, pronouns, and the community that you represent from around Michigan. And what specifically would you like to know about prosecution? The Michigan People's Assembly, we have our sponsors are with us tonight. We are sponsored by Black Lives Matter Michigan, One Love Global, the Vera Institute of Justice, Accountability for Dearborn, and our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation of Metro Lansing. And so again, we thank you for being with us tonight, and thank all of our sponsors, which you will hear from throughout tonight. And so again, we want you to fill in that comment section as we state your name, pronouns, and the community that you represent, and what would you specifically like to know about prosecution. Our time tonight will be spent around our welcome and our grounding, our place-based context, the power of prosecutors. We'll have an overview, and then our grassroots solutions. And so people always ask, what is Michigan People's Assembly? This process was birthed out of the Lansing People's Assembly. And so we are now addressing these issues on a statewide level. And so the Michigan People's Assembly is multiracial, multi-generational, multi-ideological, and multi-gender. The Assembly brings all of the voices together in a circular fashion and engages the thinking, experiences, and visions of all the participants in order to synthesize and collectively agree on action steps. No one owns this space. This is a collective space. And so once again, we want to thank you for being with us on tonight. Please fill in that comment section and let us know your name, pronouns, what part of the region of Michigan do you represent, and what are your specific questions? Where are we going? This is a question tonight. And so we're moving from charging and diversion to bail, case processing, discovery and pleas, and sentencing. So we're going to have a journey. We're on a journey on tonight. And so we want to just ground ourselves. And I want everyone to just, as we ground ourselves, just take a deep breath, because we have a big discussion tonight. And we want to make sure that we're focused and we're bringing our whole selves to this discussion. So just breathe in tonight and stretch if you have to. And then once you breathe all the way in, just breathe out and release the tension of the day. And let's do that 3 times. So let's just breathe in, and then let's just breathe out. Let's do it one more time. Let's breathe in, hold it, and breathe out. And so let's just really, I want us to just take some time and really think about those that are most impacted. We want to invite those Black-led organizations and leaders from around the state to step into this process. And we want to make sure that we have the leadership and the presence and the voices of those most impacted. And so again, we want to thank all of our sponsors that are with us on tonight. And again, we have our Dearborn for Accountability. We have those representing the ACLU, Vera Institute of Justice, as well as we have our One Love Global family. And so again, thank you for joining us tonight. Let's talk about place-based context. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues, Jordan, if she would join us for this portion.
Hi, everybody. My name's Jordan, pronounced she, her, hers. I'm a part of the One Love Global team, and tonight I am sharing with you some place-based context for this conversation we're having around the state. We're going to be sharing data in relationship to Ingham, Wayne, Kalamazoo, Oakland, Macomb, Kent, and Jackson counties primarily, but we also know that many of these patterns echo around the state. So right now, that's where the stars are located on this map of Michigan. But if your work touches any part of what we're talking about tonight, we really, like Mordecai said, invite you to connect with us to share what you're doing, because we're building collective power to change the criminal legal system. And that starts with learning from one another and centering the communities that are most impacted. And so on the next slide, as we start to explore prosecution, I was pointed out that some context would be helpful, and we thought it would be powerful to highlight racial dot maps of our communities, as well as the redlining maps produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so I helped to prepare those slides, or those maps that will be on the following slides. And the keys to those are on the current slide that you're seeing on screen. And you may wonder, how does this relate to our conversation? We're going to let some of our partners tonight talk about the local landscape of the work and the criminal legal system in relationship to these, but the overarching consideration here is that our systems of mass incarceration, prosecution included, it hasn't emerged in a vacuum. And some of these comparisons show the persistent structure of racial segregation and economic inequality. And so this first map here, it's important to note that the dots are stacked, and so it can be a little bit difficult to see the granularity at the zoomed out level. It can be easier when you zoom in. But if you advance to the next slide, this is the layer of the redlining, the redlined map, right? And so the red polygons that are on this map are those redlined areas, the grade of D, which were assigned to communities that have more Black families, where poverty were closer to industrial areas, and the bluer and greener shades were assigned to communities where more white people were living, and also with higher wealth. And so if we advance one more slide, just to show you kind of the more granular level of image here, if that will load, okay. You know, we're seeing this, and this is 2019 American Community Survey data from the census. So it's pretty up to date. And on the right side, you know, we're seeing the Grosse Pointe area along the right side of the Detroit River headed north up towards Lake St. Clair. And that's where these purplish pinkish dots are where more white people are living. The orange are representing Black community members. And if you advance one more slide, again, we'll see the comparison to where those higher graded areas are, which align with where the Grosse Pointe areas are. So again, we're seeing the persistence of racial segregation in our communities and how that was intentionally sustained, and how that leads us to our landscape of this criminal legal system that disproportionately targets Black communities, that over-polices Black communities and sustains these cycles. And so we can keep going. This is Grand Rapids. Again, this is just the racial dot map layer. And then we advance one more time. And we can see the overlay of the Homeowners Loan Corporation map with the grading All right. And then last but not least, we have a map of Lansing as well. Again, this is the layer with just the 2019, these racial categories in the dot map. And then advance one more time, and we can see again the Hulk layer where the areas that are redlined are present on this map. All right. So just, this is, the landscape is something to keep in mind as we talk about tonight, where our forces of mass incarceration are targeted towards, what communities are mostly deeply impacted by this area, and how our history has led us to this point and continues to structure these forces. And with that, I believe I will hand it back to Mordecai.
Thank you, Jordan. And we're going to hear for the next couple of minutes from our sponsors. And so first up will be Angela Waters Austin, President, Executive Director of One Love Global. And so, Angela, welcome. I like your
Thank you. You like my background? We match. You know, I had to get a plug in for our new podcast, Transform Michigan, on Michigan Business Network. Yes, check us out, michiganbusinessnetwork.com, Transform Michigan. Yes, welcome everyone to our very first Michigan People's Assembly. I am so excited about this. It's taken the better part of a year or more to actually get to this point. And representing the Lansing-based squad. I'm from Detroit. What up, though, Detroit fam? And unfortunately, our prosecutor, Carol Seaman, can't be here with us tonight, but I really want to acknowledge her because the work that we have been able to do in Lansing is largely because we have a prosecutor who is willing to work with community. And as you heard, people's assemblies are a place for co-governance. It is where we, the people, come together and we determine what policy should look like. We determine what our leadership should look like. We determine what accountability should look like. And so we're excited about doing that work with Black-led organizations across Michigan, with folks who are directly impacted, who may not have ever been connected to an organization. But this is a place for us to build together, for us to set priorities, and for us to do the long work. So we began in Ingham County as a part of a process called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Our community was chosen along with 13 other places in the country to do deep dive work in narrative change, in racial healing and relationship building, and deeper dives into our law system, what keeps us separated, looking at segregation as it persists centuries since slavery was abolished, and also looking at the economic impact. At the end of the day, our quality of life is largely determined by our ability to take care of ourselves and our families. So our prosecutor has been a part of our law team since its inception. And she said early on that she really wanted to do deep work. While she's in office, what are the areas that she can actually do the work of transformation? And so our One Love Global team has had the opportunity to facilitate workshops with her prosecutors, and that's what you see in the image to the left. That's me over there. And just really understanding, what does prosecution look like in Ingham County, because it's not the same in every community. And the more that we work through these, because this is the first in the series and you hear from other communities, you'll see that each community has a different process. Some things are the same, some things are different, and those differences are important. So we really started with just understanding what the process looks like in Ingham County, and it looks nothing like Law and Order. That was the first awakening. I'm not an attorney, I don't play one on TV, and I don't pretend to know the law system. So we are learning with you. Please understand that we are not the experts. We are the directly impacted people, and we want to understand how prosecution actually works, in particular because prosecutors are connected to police and they're connected to judges. So they see our entire law system in a very different lens. And so it was really helpful to actually engage with all of the assistant prosecutors under Carol's leadership to understand each element, from the investigation, from when the case is handed off, what does pretrial look like, what happens with bail, what happens with pleas and sentencing, the trials, like all of those pieces, we're going to break down for you. But for Ingham, what this has led to is really understanding the data. And I want to thank Vera, who you'll hear from and a lot more today, but for really helping us take a look at the data. That was really our starting point, is does the data actually reflect what we anecdotally believe is true, which is that Black people are over-policed and over-prosecuted. And as you may have seen, Lansing police data, as well as Michigan State police data, confirm that our anecdotal data is actually accurate. And the police data backs us up in terms of who actually gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets arrested, and then what happens. And so that what happens is on the prosecution side. So you'll see a lot more of that. But I really want to lift up to you that we're getting a lot of pushback. And having this statewide conversation is really important, because the Michigan Sheriff's Association has stepped into the fray in Ingham County. And our Ingham County Sheriff actually went around to every municipality and really used the data in a way to try to create fear and to get the prosecutor to back down on making these really critical policy changes in her office. And as you can see, these are some of the headlines. And we are committed to supporting prosecutors who are really committed to looking at the data, who are committed to racial equity, and most importantly, who are committed to working with community and who are accountable to community. So that's how we got here, and looking forward to hearing what prosecutor accountability looks like in other communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And we want to invite those of you that are participating tonight to be a part of our Liberation Policy Action Center. Our Liberation PAC is an action fund supporting electoral justice, influencing policy for Black liberation and building Black political power. We seek an end to unjust systems that negatively impact the Black community and its members. And in their place, we believe that we can create policies that nurture and support all citizens. To do this, we build campaigns, advocate for legislation, and support aspiring elected officials who are committed to transformative change. And so, as you can see, the QR code is there. You can pull out your phone and turn your camera on, and it'll take you right to the Liberation Policy Action Center. And so, again, if you want to get involved, and we want to make sure that you have that opportunity to get involved right away and be a part of the next steps. And so we want to hear from our partners at this time. And so I want to ask Dearborn for accountability for Dearborn, one of the representatives, I think Alexandria, to present. And I'm going to give you the screen.
Okay. So in the previous slides, we saw the racial dot map. And we saw that how it was a clear illustration that anti-Black policies and cultural norms result in segregation today. So now we're going to take the deeper dive into that and look at individual municipalities and how we're able to further examine that and see by design how this was intentionally accepted to enlarge the number of those in prison, of course, while incentivizing prosecutors to participate in harmful conduct. So in this first slide here, we have the history of Dearborn, Michigan, as it relates to racial injustices. So we see in 1926, we see that in the city of Dearborn, it was originally established as a white settlement designed by Henry Ford as a community for white workers, making it whereas Black workers were next door in Inkster and lived in worker housing. And this segregation was fueled by city ordinances and contributing policies, standard practices for homes in Dearborn to incorporate racial covenants and into their property deeds to prevent these homes from being sold to anyone who wasn't white. And we see here in 1963, we start to see the lengths that the community was willing to go to maintain that culture, that racist culture. Even a slight notice of one Black person moving into the city was enough to riot in opposition. On this next slide, we see that this continued as the years went on and morphed into intentional acts of city government's sanctioned harm that was intentionally done by former Mayor Orville Hubbard. One of the ways in which this occurred was in 1967 during the uprising in Detroit, where he instructed police officers to shoot looters on sight. And then in 1971, federal judges ordered racial desegregation of schools, but this allowed Dearborn residents to successfully resist integrated busing. And then in 1986, we see that a resolution was passed to make parks for residents only. So overall, this further prevented Black people from having access to working, recreating, and simply traveling through Dearborn. Overall, during Hubbard's reign, he intentionally prevented Black people from accessing Dearborn by creating barriers at each access point, whether it was redlining, passing resolutions to make parks for residents only, housing covenants, or resisting integrated busing. All of these are examples of how Black people were denied that right to visit Dearborn. In this next slide, we see how Dearborn's past is still very much present, and these are still open wounds that exist today. These 5 individuals were murdered by Dearborn police officers. None of them were armed. Multiple of them had mental disabilities, and all of them were Black. In the case of Janet Wilson and Kevin Matthews, the Wayne County prosecutor refused to hold officers accountable for abusing their power. And then locally, prosecutors are placing a reasonable trust in police officers when selecting charges, setting bail, gathering evidence, and recommending sentencing. We recognize the opportunity for prosecutors to prevent and mitigate criminalization through diversions and alternatives. For Janet Wilson and Kevin Matthews in particular, they both had mental disabilities and both were killed by Dearborn police officers, James Wade and Chris Hampton, and they were not held accountable for the murders. And since then, there has been no solutions put in place to prevent this from occurring again. I say this to say that it is past time for locally funded, non-police mental health response services. In this next slide here, we see these images. They depict how frequently Black people are policed. So census data revealed that 3.3% of Dearborn's residents are Black. Over 90% of residents are white classified, and the Metro Detroit regional population is only 22% Black. And this is represented in the first 2 images here. In the third and fourth image, we see that Black people accounted for 47% of all Dearborn police citations and 54% of arrests. Here we see that majority of the citations are coming from policing poverty, and the largest focus is on plate violations. And similarly, we see in the next one, we see that the same thing is occurring with the focus being on warrants, traffic, and property. In these last few slides, it shows that the cycle of escalation in relation to poverty and criminalization that is experienced in Dearborn, the role that police and the courts play at each step. For this first section, we see that not being able to afford citation and fees, things that directly impact the individual, we see that leads to them, this results in not being able to afford court fines and fees, which leads to arrests on warrants, and then the pursuit of setting higher bail due to them not being, well, due to them being deemed to what they call criminal. From there, we see that escalates to not being able to afford bail, and based on incarceration rates, the individual fits that mold once again of what they are deeming as criminal. And here we see that leads to not being able to afford or seek legal representation. In this last portion, we see the destabilization of entire communities, lack of resources, disrupting families. That escalates progressively to the impact of several people: arrests, incarceration, trauma inflicted on communities, which in turn harms our mental health. The conclusion of this is that you want to interrupt this cycle of harm early to prevent things from reaching a point where entire communities are destabilized and traumatized. From here, I'll pass it over to my colleagues, and if you have any questions, please put it in the chat.
So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Jack with Vera, and to take us further. Jack, we're so glad to have the team from Vera here on tonight, the first Michigan People's Assembly, and Vera and the entire team. You all have put so much work into Ingham and across the nation and in Michigan. So we're glad to have you. So showing you all some love tonight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Nohar. So happy to see you all. I'm going to share screen really quickly so that another one of our partners can introduce themselves. All right, Trevor, I'm going to pass it to you to introduce yourself. Thanks so much.
There we go. You can hear me now. Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for everything that we've heard so far. I'm Trevor Bechtel, and I'm with Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan. We are a research center focused on preventing and alleviating poverty. And so I'm really grateful to Alexandra for the presentation that we just heard, because it made such a clear connection between poverty and criminal justice. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the Prosecutor Transparency Project, which is a project that I work on, and make some connections to work that Vera is doing in Ingham and also in Washtenaw County. What I have here as a background to my slide is a kind of zoomed out version of the Opportunity Index, which was something that we at Poverty Solutions worked with the county to build, that shows opportunity in our county. And you can't see it very well, but it kind of echoes a bunch of the things that our dot maps and other things were showing about how economic opportunity and racial inequities are kind of layered on top of each other. In some ways, the story starts in Washtenaw County in 2017, at least from a prosecutor perspective. Friends of Restorative Justice of Washtenaw County did a court watching study in which they went to court and observed what cases were coming and what were the kind of circumstances of those cases, realized that Black and brown people were being prosecuted and coming to court at a much higher rate. Those cases weren't settling out, and cases that that Black youth were being charged with were being charged at a higher rate. So it's more likely that those would be felony charges rather than misdemeanor charges. That was the most kind of striking thing. People didn't pay a lot of attention to that report. But then a few years later, the Citizens for Racial Equity in Washtenaw put out the CREW report, which did a much kind of deeper dive into the data in Washtenaw County, looked at both the kind of prosecutor and court systems, and found really significant racial disparities. And all of this was kind of done with data that they were able to get by putting through FOIA requests and kind of other ways that they were able to kind of access the data. A significant change happened in Washtenaw County at the beginning of 2021 when Ellie Savitt was elected prosecutor, and we had a sea change in terms of the prosecutor in our county. So we went from a kind of traditional law and order prosecutor to a progressive prosecutor who was really interested in understanding what this data meant about both the operation of the prosecutor's office and then the operation of law enforcement that feeds into that and the courts that work on those cases. And so the Prosecutor Transparency Project came into being right as Ellie came into office. It's a partnership between the ACLU, who are funding it through funding that they get from other places. My center, Poverty Solutions, Michigan Law, JJ Prescott, a professor there, is kind of the lead researcher here, and then the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office. And we are working to create a report on racial inequities in the system. And it's taking us a long time to kind of dig through the data and figure out what is actually there, and to also answer relevant questions about the data. So how can we compare cases to each other? How do you make a fair comparison? What is recidivism? How do you calculate that if a person is switching counties or other things like this? So there are a lot of really interesting questions here that we're kind of getting a hold on. One result of this will be that we'll publish a dashboard for the prosecutor's office in Washtenaw County, and that'll be based on these prosecutorial performance indicators. You can put that into Google and you can find out a lot. This is a nationwide standard for kind of looking at prosecutors' offices. But understanding those indicators requires understanding the system to a certain extent, and we recognize that a dashboard that we create that we want to be useful to the public is going to need to be able to do that in an accessible way. And so we're thinking those things through. When we're done in Washtenaw, when we have a dashboard up and running, we're going to go to Oakland County. The prosecutor there wants us to build a dashboard, and then come along to Ingham County. And we'll be building on the great work that this Vera team has been doing there and continuing it as we work to build a dashboard in Ingham. And those three counties will, for us, form a pilot that we hope can then kind of be put into other places all across the state. So that's an introduction to our project. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. It's great to see you all and to hear these great presentations.
Thank you so much, Trevor. And thank you again for everyone who's here. It's been really great to be able to get brought into, and welcomed into the coalition of work that's happening across the state, but locally in Ingham for sure. So I'm Jack Helez. I use they, them pronouns. I am a senior program associate with the Vera Institute of Justice. I'll give very quick, brief background about me. Before working at the Vera Institute, I used to work in New York City government, where I investigated the NYPD for their policies and practices as it relates to everyday civil rights issues. And before that, I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn DA's office, where I prosecuted domestic violence cases. I worked there for about 4 years, and I did policy work in that office as well, looking at questions around how LGBTQ folks in particular are being treated in domestic violence prosecution, but I also worked on a host of other cases as well. And I come into this work as somebody who has family who is heavily system impacted, right? And has people that I care about and love in my life who have also been system impacted, in that I kind of find that, it's really important to bring those experiences into the work of trying to, talk to prosecutors and talk to elected prosecutors in a way that they can understand, but also in a way that's, amplifying the concerns that come from the people. So today's presentation is really going to be about a high-level presentation about what it is that prosecutors do, broken down by different decision points. Because prosecutors have the right to charge, that's part of their powers. What does that look like? And what areas of discretion do they have throughout a case? So today will be a high-level conversation, and we look forward to future conversations where we're going to dive into the issues a little bit more deeply. Thank you for sharing what some folks were interested in. I kind of took some notes on the side. So if you see me looking down, like off to the side, that's what I'll be doing. Because folks kind of already mentioned some of the things that they want to hear about. So I hope to answer your questions. If you have any questions about content, if you need something better explained, please feel free to utilize the chat to ask questions. We'll be monitoring it. And yeah, I look forward to today's convo. With that, I'm going to pass it to Sarah, another member of our team, to get us started.
Thanks, Jack, and hey, everyone. It is so great to be here. I'm Sarah, they, them. I'm also a member of the Vera team, and thank you for sharing some of that love towards us, Mordecai. Just want to share it right back. I remember when we started working with Carol's office and we reached out to y'all and asked if you would be interested in collaborating about teaching us about your goals and having them guide our goals. And just so thankful that we've gotten to work with the One Love Global team, because I really can't imagine what our work would have looked like without them. And looking through who's in the Zoom tonight, I also see some folks that we've just gotten to like connect with here and there throughout the 2 years that we've worked with Carol's office. So for those folks, you'll know who you are. It's good to see you in the audience tonight. So a little bit about who we are as the Reshaping Prosecution program at Vera. We just wanted to give you all a little context of sort of like the different perspectives that make up our team, because I think that sort of influences the way that we do the work. But our team it's sort of shifting all the time. This is a pretty accurate snapshot of it, but it's made up of folks who are former prosecutors themselves and who sort of think really critically also about deconstructing what that role means and are able to sort of, I think, have those prosecutor to prosecutor talks. There are also folks who are qualitative and quantitative data analysts, since it's a pretty big part of our work that we'll talk about a little later. And then there are also folks who are program associates who bring sort of a more like miscellaneous bucket of perspectives as well. Folks who have worked in community organizing, in education, and in other areas. So if we want to go to the next slide about what we do. This slide is a lot of words, so I think it's maybe easier to talk about it in terms of the story of our program. So Trevor, hearing that you all started seeing the accountability work in Washtenaw really start up 5 years ago was fascinating, because I think that kind of connects to nationally around 5 or so years ago, sort of like a larger movement of communities coming together to organize around prosecutor accountability. And some of the early steps of those campaigns were bringing attention to the fact that prosecutors' offices, the heads of those offices, are often an elected position. And we're also often motivated because folks were figuring out who was at the head of the prosecutor's office and wanted to elect them out of office. And so I think a big example of that was maybe the like 2016 or 2017 race in Chicago, where community organizations came together in a campaign because they were looking to push Anita Alvarez out of office, who had a very, very traditional law and order approach. And out of that also emerged to elect Kim Foxx into office, because Kim Foxx ran with a more reform-minded platform. And so folks were organizing around, how do we get reform-minded folks into office? And then once they are in office, how are we holding them accountable to sort of translate those campaign promises into actual policies and practices? So as we started to see more and more reform-minded prosecutors being elected, our team at Vera sort of emerged to fill that going from campaign promises into policy and practice. And the way that we work is that prosecutors' offices who are interested in taking a different approach will apply to work with us. And then we'll have engagements with them that are about 2 years that are trying to do a few different things. So on this slide, you see one of the things that we do is that we analyze the office's data. So going by decision point, looking at what are the racial disparities there. And with that analysis, we're both trying to inform, what the policy and practice work will be, but also releasing that to the public, so that can be sort of sustainably shared, and so that the community can use that data in the way that they're looking. So sort of, I feel like explaining what consulting is always leads to, my family is always like, you explain it and we still don't know what it means, but those are some examples of the things that we do. And another piece I would add here is we are a national nonprofit. So part of what we try to bring is a national perspective that is grounded in lots of hyperlocal sort of places. And so how are we sharing when we're working with an office in, say, California, and we're learning there about a community accountability coalition? How are we sharing that then in, say, Minnesota with folks that we're working with and helping to create those connections nationally at a state level and locally? And so this is the full scope of the offices that we work with right now. So it's sort of from coast to coast, and then you all see what we'll see here. We work with Carol's office in Ingham County, and then Jack and I also work pretty closely with John Choi's office, which is in Ramsey County, Minnesota. And so another sort of chapter, I would say, to the story of our program is that it, from its origins, had racial justice as a focus. And part of the reason was that why that was it was being formed at a time where we were seeing decarceration happen nationally, but seeing that decarceration did not necessarily lead to a decrease in racial disparities. Often that was happening at times where racial disparities were either staying the same or increasing. So part of the origin of our program was starting with, if we were putting decreasing racial disparities at the center of a decarceral framework that centers public safety and the needs of communities most directly impacted, what would that look like? So for Carol's office is for us part of our Motion for Justice campaign. So I'll stop there too. If there's anything that Jack, you would want to add, but bar that, we're going to show this video. I think it's about 5 minutes long, but it kind of does a summary of what we'll spend the rest of the presentation talking about in more detail. So we thought that it might be a helpful foundation to start with.
The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. We are addicted to locking people up. Despite having only 5% of the world's population, the U.S. has 25% of the world's prisoners. The land of the free, it seems, is anything but. While we have been building a national consciousness around the causes of mass incarceration, little attention has been paid to one of the system's most powerful actors, prosecutors. A prosecutor, also known as a district attorney, represents the government in criminal proceedings against any person accused of a crime. They are actually referred to as the people because they are supposed to represent the interests of the community. Their job is to seek justice, not convictions. And prosecutors have more power than most of us realize. Prosecutors alone decide whether or not to charge a crime. They get to decide who is prosecuted and who gets a pass. They also decide what crimes to charge you with. This is important because the more serious the charge, the greater the risk a person faces by taking their case to trial. This increased risk puts pressure on a person to give up their rights and take a deal, even if they are innocent. And despite their legal duty to turn over evidence that could prove you are innocent, prosecutors themselves, all in secret, decide when to apply that rule. Given all their discretionary power, prosecutors ultimately determine how the system treats the most vulnerable people in our communities. But the problem is not just the unfair amount of power prosecutors have. The problem is the abuse of that power, which is unfortunately all around us. Investigative reporter Radley Balco explains that one of the most powerful positions in public service, a position that carries with it the authority not only to ruin lives, but in many cases, the power to end them, is one of the positions most shielded from liability and accountability. And he's right. Over 40 years ago, the Supreme Court gave prosecutors absolute immunity, a powerful legal protection that is even greater than the protection the law gives to police officers. Absolute immunity is a big deal, a really big deal. And it means that in our current legal system, who we elect to represent the people becomes even more critical. Here's what you can do. Find out who the elected district attorney is in your jurisdiction. Get to know where they stand on the issues you care about most. Make sure you know what policies and practices are implemented in your name every day. Hold prosecutors accountable with the power of your vote. It's time to ask whether your district attorney is standing up for the needs and values of the communities they serve. So, do prosecutors exercise significant power? Absolutely. But they can only exercise the power that you give them. And that starts with winning an election, which means the most powerful player in our system is really the voter. That's you.
Hey everyone. So what do we know about Michigan? So we're going to go through some high-level data points to kind of talk about, prosecution, incarceration. Just to paint a picture, we know that Black folks are about 14% of the state's population, but are 53% of the incarcerated population. That's also an average, right? So your given county could have a different disparity. State police reports found that arrests for obstruction have increased 17% from 2015 to 2020. And again, we're going to talk about the relationship between police and prosecution. And in that same report, they found that Black men were nearly 6 times more likely to be charged with resisting and obstructing law. Among people who are incarcerated in Michigan for felony firearm charges, Black folks comprise 82% of those sentenced. Now, for some, the Felony Firearm Law is an enhancement law that gives a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 years if you're convicted on it. So even though we know that Black folks and white folks in Michigan both own firearms and have guns, Black folks make up 82% of those who get sentenced for having them unlawfully. We also know that Black youth are almost 3 times more likely to be arrested, and then a little over 3 times more likely to be transferred to adult court. And the decision about whether or not to press charges against a youth and transferring that youth to adult court are decisions that the prosecutor would make. Lastly, we also know that 1 in 11 Black women in prison that are in prison for life without parole sentences. In Michigan, Michigan is the 4th highest state for folks who are serving life without parole, because you probably know the history better than me, but because Michigan is one of the few states in the country that doesn't have the death penalty. When a state doesn't have a death penalty, the default trend, or the trend tends to show that the default is to then offer folks life without parole. And so in Michigan, we see that 1 out of 11 Black women who are in prison are serving sentences for life without parole, in comparison to 1 out of 59 white women who are in prison or in Michigan are serving sentences for life without parole. I know that these statistics are really heavy. And so, we can take a breath and just think or reflect about that, think about whether or not that's reflective of our own communities, because a lot of statewide, numbers, because of the segregation that we saw earlier in the presentation, a lot of statewide numbers are going to be averages. And so in particular counties, you're going to have more or less. In a particular block, in a particular area, you're going to have these disparities increase or decrease. So who works at a prosecutor's office? So you have your elected district attorney, as the video had mentioned. They're often elected for 4-year terms. In the office is also a bunch of other attorneys who kind of carry out the day-to-day work of what the elected prosecutor was elected for. And so the office is often organized into either subject matter specialties like domestic violence, like homicide, maybe even like trafficking, for example, but it also gets organized oftentimes into the tasks that they have to complete. So some offices will have a particular area or particular people who are in charge of, let's say, pressing the initial charges, reviewing, the paperwork from the initial arrest, and we'll see what that process looks like in this presentation. Other folks who also work at the prosecutor's office, you have other staff, you have advocates, you can have social workers, you have victim advocates, you can have paralegals, there's investigators, because even though the police, might have made an arrest and passed the case on to the prosecutor may want to do an even more investigation, especially if they're more serious charges. There's also administrative staff. Prosecutors' offices receive state and federal funding, and they also receive funding from the Violence Against Women's Act. It is up for renewal soon. This is the Violence Against Women's Act was a national bill that was passed along with the 1994 crime bill that set aside money and resources to go towards supporting, what they define as violence against women. A lot of the money is also shared with prosecutors' offices, particularly to like fund domestic violence sort of investigations or other sort of support services in the office. So in 2019, 95% of elected prosecutors were white. We are seeing an increase in prosecutors of color who are getting elected into these positions. So I'm actually kind of curious as to what the percentage can look like for 2022, or maybe by the end of 2022, because there's a lot of elections happening this year. Prosecutors have historically had close relationships with law enforcement and other law enforcement system stakeholders. We kind of saw that also through the video and through some of the other presentations today. And something that's also really important to recognize is a lot of prosecutors actually run unopposed. Communities like historically haven't paid as much attention to them. But as Sarah has pointed out, as Trevor pointed out, a lot more people are paying attention to prosecutors' elections now. So it's very possible that that number has also changed because a lot of communities are paying more attention because of the Black Lives Matter movement and other, and other publicized instances of police violence against and targeting against Black and Brown communities. So I'm gonna share over to Sarah for the next few slides.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So I think we saw this in like a little bit of a different different version earlier when Mordecai was walking through where we're going. So some things that I think can be challenging around working with prosecutors' offices is the differences state by state, as well as the differences office by office. So really every office, when it comes down to it, is sort of wonky in that they'll do things in their own way. But we put together this sort of like timeline of a case as a template of what the common decision points are that the prosecutors are taking. So the buckets that we have are charging and diversion, the decisions that they're making there, decisions that are being made at bail, sort of a bucket of case processing, which includes a lot of things, including discovery and pleas, and then ultimately sentencing. And if any of these pieces like discovery and pleas are new terms, no worries, we will go into each of these section by section and talk about what they are. And if we want to go to the next slide, we thought that a helpful way to talk about it would be through an example of a specific incident and the way that a person, in this case, the person's name is Raja's case, could be handled by the prosecutor's office. So I'll just read out the scenario, which is Raja, a 26-year-old, pushes his mother during an argument. She falls and fractures her hip. Raja leaves their apartment. A neighbor hears the mother yelling for help and calls the police. Police find Raja hiding a few blocks away, arrest him, and take him to jail. The mother goes to the hospital and gets released with instructions to stay on bed rest for a couple of weeks. Both Raja and their mother are undocumented immigrants. We want to go to the next one. So one other thing we'll add to this is that Raja's criminal history is that Raja was once convicted of theft for stealing beer from a 7-Eleven last year. So this is the situation that the rest of the presentation is going to be based off of. And I think with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jack, to talk about sort of the first part of what will happen with Raja's case.
Thanks, Sarah. So Raja, so taking it from there, so if the police made an initial arrest, right, the police can either release Raja back into the community and tell him or tell them to come back for another court date, or they can hold them in custody. And when they hold them in custody, then it's just a quicker process. That's kind of why I differentiated between the two. But either way, the police are going to send their paperwork to the prosecutor's office. They're going to send what they think the charges should be, or the charges under which they arrested the person, the allegations, what they think happened. So they'll send that paperwork to the prosecutor. And the prosecutor has different options. The prosecutor can authorize the charges that the police are recommending. They can choose different charges, or they can decline all of them. So we're going to look at just the charging aspect of this. What do? The prosecutor is going to look at the allegations. They're going to look at the paperwork that the police submit to them, where the police kind of write down what they think happened. The prosecutor is then going to determine what they think is going on. For a case like Raja's, it's very likely that the prosecutor would reach out to speak to Raja's mother to find out how she feels about the case. And so during the course of this, they'll find out, we'll try to find out what happened directly from the person who was impacted, think about what they think is going on, and then determine what charges would apply to that set of facts, according to how the statutes are written in the law. And so it's at this point that I think it's really important for us to think about survivors' rights or crime victims' rights. So in Michigan, it's in the Michigan Constitution that, certain victims of crime have the right to be treated with fairness and respect. They have the right to reasonable protection What does that mean? They have the right to be notified of court proceedings, to talk to the prosecuting attorney, and to make a statement at sentencing. I think it's really important to understand that prosecutors don't have a legal obligation to the person who is a victim of a crime. They're not representing that person. Because a prosecutor is an elected prosecutor, the people who work for the elected prosecutor, that's why they say they are for the people. They're not an attorney for the person who was hurt or who filed the complaint, I should say. And so every state is going to have different requirements around the sort of things that crime victims are entitled to, including compensation, whether or not they can go to certain hearings or sentences. So we included here what crime victims in Michigan are entitled to, but I do want to point out that there are exceptions. So folks who are accepted, who can't necessarily claim, the sort of rights that a victim who would qualify could claim for, such as compensation, include people who are actually incarcerated. And also it includes people who are also charged with a crime, with a related crime that's coming out of the same incident for which they are accusing, they can't be charged for a crime for something that arises out of the same situation. So what happens is, for example, if there's an incident of police abuse, if the police arrested the person and charged them with resisting or obstructing, for example, which is a common charge, right? Or if the police arrest someone for assaulting a police officer, but that person was also hurt, then that means that they wouldn't be eligible underneath the way in which victim is defined by the law and not be eligible for compensation. So I think that's important for people to understand, not only that cases can go on whether or not a victim wants to, but also, and that prosecutors don't have a legal obligation to do what the victim wants in a case, but also certain victims are not covered for compensation and for other sort of, rights that you would have. So that is particularly relevant to this particular case because we're talking about a situation where we do have a victim and we have some injuries because the mother had to go to the hospital. She had a broken hip. So what are the areas of discretion for prosecutors in the area of charging? So in the video, we talk about how prosecutors have the power to charge and that is a huge power, but what does that actually mean? Right. So I kind of broke this down into questions so that folks can kind of think about what that could mean when you have an actual set of facts, a certain case, a certain incident in front of somebody who is a prosecutor, and now they have to make a decision about it. So we have to think about the ways in which that person who's evaluating the case is understanding what those facts are and what they mean, how it's understood. So think about the situation between Raja and their mother, right? The prosecutor is getting the snapshot of the incident, but the prosecutor doesn't necessarily have the whole context, right? They're only finding out what the police are sharing with them and whatever, if anything, Raja's mom is willing to share. So there's questions about what are the facts, how are they understood, how are they evaluated, and what's the cultural and socioeconomic, what is the full context of that situation? Also, what amount of information is necessary? What amount of evidence is necessary to justify pressing charges against somebody? So at what level does it rise? Is it enough for the police to say, oh, we know that, Raj's mom told us that they, did something to them and that this is what happened to their mom. Is that enough? Or is it enough to hear it directly from the mother? Because that could be different, right? It's almost like a game of telephone sometimes. So think about what threshold of information is required to justify a charge. I can say that when I was a prosecutor in Brooklyn, if we couldn't get a hold of the victim in the case and all we had was a police officer, but maybe we had other evidence like photos or medical records, we might still go forward and press charges in that case, even without the victim's even without hearing from the victim yet. So what threshold of information is necessary? Because that is up to the discretion of the prosecutor. How are the charges selected? Are we trying to go for the harshest charge? Are we trying to go for the least harsh charge? I know it's weird, right? Say that 5 times fast. How are they selected? Are we going after the most serious crime that we think covers what happened? Or are we going over, or are we just going with just enough? And that can make a difference if we think about crimes, when crimes exist in degrees, right? So you can be assaulted, but for example, there can be different levels of assault. You can have something with more injury or less injury, and that is going to have an impact on like how serious of a charge it is. So how are these charges selected? Because you can have enough evidence for something less. And then what are the collateral consequences of pressing certain charges? So I'm just sticking with assault because this is an easy example. So for an assault case, if the injuries are not that bad, the prosecutor has the discretion to charge something less than an assault. There's such thing as like an attempted assault, right? But if the injuries are bad, they had to go to the hospital, but it's not like permanent damage, like the charges can be a little higher. And if you have really bad damage, right, like they can stack up. So how the charges are selected and then the consequences that can come along with that are really important to understand, because somebody can be charged. This used to happen in New York City, at least, is that certain people that have certain licenses. So in New York City, you can imagine like we have a lot of caddies or like people who drive like taxis or a cab, right? So there's a restriction. Like if you're charged with, let's say, a crime, some people can lose their professional licenses. But if the crime is a little bit less, that maybe it's not an A misdemeanor, maybe it's a B misdemeanor, for example, if that's how it's defined, then they may not have the collateral consequences of having their professional license suspended during the course of while the case is open. Same thing for immigration. It's really important to know that like you can technically get flagged for deportation simply from an arrest. That was something that the Trump administration was open about. The Obama administration didn't really prioritize people who were arrested. They tended to prioritize people with certain types of convictions, but there's discretion. And there's been plenty of, stories out there about how much discretion certain ICE officers have. So somebody can be charged with something, not yet be convicted, and also be possibly facing deportation. So I will say that different cities kind of handle that differently. That's where the term sanctuary city comes from. So in certain cities, there are certain agencies that will be in contact with the Department of Homeland Security, and there's certain cities that won't, and that's just legislation that is passed. So for example, Wayne County is considered a sanctuary city. Ingham County is considered sanctuary, but every county and like every city has it defined very specifically, and there can be exceptions to that. So even New York City is considered a sanctuary city, but if you are charged with something that's, let's say if it's like a very violent felony or a violent incident, you could be facing even more collateral consequences, because you can be an exception, or at least in New York, that would be an exception to a sanctuary city. So thinking about collateral consequences, the charging phase is super important, because you can be impacted in ways outside of your own case. There's also other actors that can kind of play a role in this sort of power that prosecutors have when it comes to charging, because there's questions about who are the police stopping in the first place? Who are the police arresting and searching in the first place? And the conduct of what the police can do and not do is defined by local and state laws. So if we want to have an impact on the charging aspect of what prosecutors do, what do prosecutors charge? What we really have to think about is what conduct itself is considered criminal. what conduct is criminalized, what conduct are we considering to be a crime, and the consequences associating with that, as well as what are we defining that police can and cannot do. And when we make limitations, or you can change the state laws, you can change local laws to do that particular thing. And so there are cities across the country who, and jurisdictions across the country who have passed laws over the past, few years, especially in the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, that kind of take away from what police are allowed to stop people for, because all of that can be defined by law. So, and then thinking about what conduct is criminalized, you can decriminalize something as well, right? So that it's not something that goes to the prosecutor's office in the first place, because it's something that the community has decided that they don't think should go through a criminal system. And so a lot of people think about drug decriminalization might be the first thing that comes to mind, right? Passing marijuana decriminalization bills. That's what that did. It took it away as it's no longer criminal. Therefore, prosecutors aren't even getting those cases. People are not supposed to be getting arrested. So we think about what happens to Raja.
Sorry, if I could just share a question that came up in the chat. Someone in the chat asked, did you observe that some in law enforcement would state that they didn't care if the evidence wasn't strong for a particular case because the accused was likely guilty or guilty of something else that they got away with?
So the question is, if I've heard that happen by law enforcement, yes. As a former prosecutor, I can definitely say that. I think what we think about is, again, it's about the discretion of how much information, what's the threshold of information that you need to have at charging. So another great example is resisting and obstructing, right? So with the rise of body camera footage, a lot of people are starting to push back against these accusations of resisting, obstructing, or even assaulting an officer. And they ask for body cam footage so that they can say, is it really fair? And so something that does happen that prosecutors have passed policies about, including Carol actually passed a policy about this, is that she wants to see the body camera footage at the charging stage. If a police officer is looking to arrest somebody and charge them with assaulting an officer or resisting and obstructing. She's saying, I want to see the body cam footage right away, as opposed to just going along with what the police say, pressing the charges and then getting the footage later. So that's a common way in which we're thinking about what threshold of information do you need, but it can apply to anything. I would say that in the prosecutor world, have I heard specifically a prosecutor say, well, we know this person is guilty of something else, therefore, let's go forward on this? Unfortunately, I kind of have, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have any evidence. It's a question of what threshold should we have, and that's the area of discretion. That can be defined however communities feel as though it should be defined. But as of right now, the Supreme Court, as you heard in the video, gives prosecutors that full power to charge. I hope that answers your question. That's a really good question. So in thinking about what's going to happen with what could happen with Raja, so prosecutor does call Raja's mother. The mother says that she wants Raja to get help and doesn't want to press charges. So we're going to assume that mom didn't really give much information. So what happens? Again, it's up to the prosecutor as to what they want to happen or what they feel is the right thing to do in this case. And they do have the power to go forward without Raja's mother possibly. So the prosecutor can try to decline the case, or the prosecutor can, if they wanted to, decline to charge the case. They have that power to just say, okay, fine, we're not going to go forward. They can also, depending on the resources available, and this will come up later, they can also divert the case. So they can say, you know what, I'm not pressing charges, but I agree that Raja needs help. So I'm going to refer Raja to maybe, get a needs assessment done or something, or maybe connect Raja with a local community-based organization that can provide some services if Raja has maybe some mental health challenges or has some other sort of needs. A prosecutor can also go forward and charge a misdemeanor, or they can possibly charge a felony depending on how bad the injuries are and how the statutes are written. I would say oftentimes in a case like this, there is going to be charges pressed because of the concern for Raj's mother. Oftentimes in a case like this, oftentimes the court is going to implement probably even like a stay away order or an order of protection or some sort of order that says that Raja can't have contact with their mother. And so because that's also going to be in place, if the case is straight up dismissed, that means that order of protection or a stay away order or restraining order is going to also be dismissed possibly. So an office would be inclined to still press charges in a case like this and want to investigate further and find out more information, see if they can get Raja's mom into the office to talk to them in person and see what's going on.
Hey, Jack, can you give us some insight on the consultative process? So as an individual prosecutor is weighing all of these different options, what's the protocol? Is there a meeting? We're asking, opening the questions. Do I just decide this arbitrarily based on how I feel? Do I refer to someone for experience? How does that work on a day-to-day?
Okay, so that really depends on office practices and resources. So I can say that if it's a misdemeanor case, a person who's charging the misdemeanor might just be another attorney who doesn't have to get sign off. Sometimes they do have to get an approval by a supervisor. So it really depends on the office. And then the extent to which they're talking with the victim or finding out what happened. Some offices might talk directly with the police officer. Some offices will rely strictly on the paperwork and just be reviewing paperwork instead of interviewing the officer and talking to them on the phone. Also, the same thing with talking to Raja's mother. They might call Raja's mom at charging and say, hey, this is who I am, and we want to talk to you about what happened. They might ask her to come into the office. For the charging phase, if Raja is being held in, meaning that like they're being held in custody with police, it is very unlikely that the prosecutor's office is going to get Raja's mom to come to the office to talk to them about it. But somebody in Raja's mother's position, depending on how she feels, like they can reach out to the office directly. And depending on resources, the office might reach out to her directly over the phone. They may not at the charging phase. So they might reach out later, but in determining whether or not to press any charges, they may or may not call her. It really depends on the jurisdiction and the capacity and priorities, I think. So, and after, in terms of what does it look like to make the decision to press charges, if the person who's reviewing the case, they may or may not talk to the officer, they may or may not talk to Raja's mom, and they're going to look over all the paperwork, and then they may or may not talk to a supervisor to get approval about the decision. So here we're going to pause, and I'm just wondering if folks want to share in the chat we have about, for a few minutes to think about what would you do? What would you like to see happen? Would you be willing to just dismiss the case straight up just because Raja's mom doesn't want to press charges? And I'm not trying to set you up with that question because there are different people. Excuse me, I sneeze a lot. There's different people who might do different things. So feel free to share in the chat while we breathe and reflect. Yeah, so I actually have the chat open. I don't know if you can see it or not, even because I'm sharing screen, but you want Raja's mother to get help, to see what care she needs. flesh out what help means for her and her son. Another person said that they would want to see diversion based on, the mother's wishes, and he's risking deportation, correct? And he may, benefit from therapy and help. Great points. So we're going to go on to talk about diversion. I'm going to switch it over to Sarah.
So I see some folks have continued to add to the chat, which is great. And I'm seeing in a few of folks' comments that they're mentioning that what they would want to pursue is diversion. So I'm glad that we're getting an opportunity to talk about it now. And part of what why we wanted to talk about diversion is because diversion can mean so many different things to different people. But if we look at where it is sort of in the flow charts that we were looking at, it's sort of this additional option at charging of not fully charging the case in a traditional way, not declining the case, but diverting it. And if we want to go to the next slide, Jack, what is diversion? So broadly speaking, it's a way to sort of just do an alternative to the traditional path of prosecution. We have some criteria that as a program we use to talk about what diversion is. And for us, that means that diversion is something that happens as early as possible within a person's case. So that means for us that it is pre-charge, that when someone is being offered diversion, this is before they have had a charge put onto their record. And it's also for us something that diversion is diversion to a community-based response. So for example, if folks are maybe familiar with some forms of restorative justice work, in this situation, could diversion look like, rather than the prosecutor's office going forward with a case and charging it, checking in with Raja and Raja's mom, seeing if they would be interested in participating in a facilitated process where a restorative justice facilitator would check in with both of them separately and then facilitate a dialogue where they could talk about what harm happened, how did that harm impact everybody who was involved, and what are the things that people would like to see to have the harm repaired, which I think sort of goes to what some people in the chat were saying or what they want to have happen. For us, that restorative justice process would have to live within community practitioners, a community-based organization. And we say some of those things specifically because one of the difficulties of diversion is sometimes what's referred to as diversion is something more akin to alternative sentencing. So someone has still been charged with a case, potentially has been convicted, and is then just sort of giving a non-jail sentence that still comes with a lot of the same consequences. So other things that diversion could look like could be drug and mental health treatment. Again, do those live in community-based organizations, or are those living within courts that in some ways maybe reproduce a lot of the features of the criminal legal system, but are being called diversion? So those are some of the things that we put out there to consider. I think there might be one more. Yeah, thanks. Jack, if you want to go to the next one. Diversion is also an area that is new to some prosecutors' offices, or at least the expansion of diversion is something that is new. And so as prosecutors are developing, say, diversion policies, some of the different pieces of discretion that they might be considering are who is or isn't offered diversion and why. So for example, is diversion offered just for misdemeanors, for cases that are considered quote unquote less serious, or are they offered for felonies? If they're offered for felonies, is there a distinction between violent felonies and non-violent felonies? Is diversion, is there criteria based off of age? Is diversion only for, say, for example, youth, or is there diversion opportunities for adults? And then a big factor that we often see that's restricting who is eligible for their case to be diverted is if someone has a criminal history. So if, say, someone has any previous conviction, then they may be automatically excluded from diversion. Or if they've had multiple prior convictions, they may be excluded from diversion. And we bring this up too because we think about how does this impact who ultimately has access to diversion. So for example, if someone is coming from a community that has always been over-policed and therefore has a criminal history record because they've been targeted by police multiple times, and then there's a diversion program that's restricted based off of criminal history, how is that compounding sort of inequity, especially for, say, Black folks who would be subject to that? And then another question or another area of discretion for prosecutors is if they're sort of the ones who are pulling the lever of diverting folks, who are they diverting to? So again, is it a, say, program that would live within the courts? Is it a program that would live within other system stakeholders? Is it a program that would, say, live with a community-based organization? And then we put in here too, for other actors, what services and programmings are available and for who. I think in our work, sometimes we find that there are communities who say they do healing work in lots of different ways and are thinking about, you know, how can we say like build that into a container that the prosecutor office could be diverted to. And so they're building what these alternative looks like. But sometimes it's also a question of like, sometimes there are a lot of alternatives out there, but the question is the prosecutor's office willing to work with those alternatives? So that's another area of discretion. And so I think we can, yeah, we'll stop there. I know this was an area that folks had some questions about. So if we want to take some time to sort of reflect on this, and if there's things that folks want to raise, we can talk about those too.
I think one of the questions that has come up is just the diversion programs, like, you know, what's really out there in terms of, you know, diversion. And I know we didn't, you know, necessarily prepare for that particular question, but there's a lot of concern about are there enough avenues and programs and those kinds of things. Can someone speak to that?
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, in terms of availability of diversion programs, it is incredibly like specific to particular areas. Like it really depends on what your local community has or has capacity for. But I can say that there are examples of community spaces. So there's community-based organizations all across this country who go to their prosecutor and then say, hey, we've been doing reentry, for example. And in our reentry work, we hold groups where we talk about, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy, or we have like groups where we break down toxic masculinity. We have groups that we have qualified, you know, restorative justice practitioners, or rather like transformative justice practitioners, or you might just say we have community healers, right? And that exist in these spaces. And so sometimes these organizations go to the DA's office and they're like, hey, we got this stuff. I would love for you to start sending me referrals of cases. And there are orgs that do that. Actually, we'll share our Motion for Justice website in the chat. And I see Rubina raise their hand, so go ahead.
Oh,
now
yeah.
with your
I mean,
question.
well, just because Allie did ask me a question, and it's a very astute question, because there aren't enough diversion options or treatment court options in Michigan. Some judges love them, but it really, I think it's a leadership issue. You have to have, judicial leadership for sure. You have to have, like you said, the right community organizations. And definitely, I think in the prosecutor's office, you have to have the right leadership. But one of the, some of the treatment courts that I've been involved with, when you had that, those components, you're getting a more successful outcome. But when there's any hesitancy in the leadership, there isn't a lot of, robust opportunity. And they seem to want to always sample this. They feel like, this isn't a solution. This is just only good for, really innocent people who shouldn't have been here in the first place. So you might even see racial disparities there. So I think, it is really an area where we can be, as community, members, talking to our, leaders and saying, no, we want this. We want this to be robust and considered, and there are great services in the community that can be brought to bear to do harm reduction, rather than just incarceration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. You're absolutely right. This is really, it's an area that is ripe for community to be able to come together and go to your electeds, but it is very subjective. Something that you reminded me of also is that we find that folks who experience homelessness are oftentimes excluded from diversion because they tend to have the longest records, and they tend to have been offered diversion services before. And that also tends to sometimes be an exclusionary factor. It's like, oh, well, we already put them in this program and they didn't do well in it, or they didn't show up, and so we're not going to offer it again. And so it ends up, compounding on each other. Same thing for folks who in particular are formerly incarcerated have, violent convictions on their record, and violent as however people want to, however the office is defining it, really. Or if somebody has a felony record, the likelihood of them being able to be offered diversion is way less, because a lot of offices are uncomfortable with offering diversion to people with certain criminal histories. And so this is an area that, again, is oftentimes up to the discretion of your elected prosecutor, that you as a community can talk to them about what's available in your community and say, hey, we want to be doing X, Y, and Z. We want you to refer cases in this way. And, they're an elected official, so you can call on them however you like, but in whatever way works for you and your community. Were there any other questions for diversion? You can breathe. I know that these topics can be really heavy, and I'll just honestly say that when I was a prosecutor, it's very hard to not get frustrated. So I'm definitely making space for the fact that I know that this stuff is very heavy and folks can be very frustrated hearing some of this. Okay. So we're going to move on to bail, and I'm going to pass it back to Sarah to talk about bail.
Thanks, Jack. So just going back to sort of the template that we had, we can see that often the next decision that prosecutors have influence over is whether or not to ask for bail. So if we want to go to the next slide. Say that the prosecutors pushing forward charges. The next step would be that they're going to submit those charges and also a bail recommendation to the judge. And then at another court proceeding, oftentimes it's called the arraignment, the judge is going to make a decision about whether or not to, one, put a cash bond, aka ask for cash bail for that person, give no bond, and say, I think, Jack, by this we were meaning remand, right, of someone where, is that correct, for no bond?
Yes.
Okay. So say there's a situation, maybe someone is being charged for a violent felony and the judge is making a decision that this person isn't even going to have the option of bail. They're going to have to be held pre-trial. Or the judge may decide to directly release that person, that they can go home and go back to their community while they're waiting trial. Or they might decide release with conditions. So one of the most common conditions being maybe they're released with, say, ankle monitoring or some other form of monitoring where they're maybe home but have these restrictions that they would have to report to. And so bail is another one of those pieces that can be very different state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But in Michigan, what the statute says is that the judge is supposed to make that evaluation based on a person's quote unquote likelihood to appear at their trial, and then also based off of public safety considerations, which effectively is translating to how the judge is evaluating what that person's conduct might be and if they might harm the community while they're, say, in the community awaiting their trial. So obviously those criteria themselves are very, very subjective. And the question is, well, how are judges making that decision? So they'll get the recommendation from a prosecutor. Michigan is also a state with a risk assessment tool that is meant to reduce unnecessary detention, assure court attendance, and public safety. Those are what the risk assessment tool states as their purposes. And the risk assessment tool is sort of like, it's often a survey that folks will fill out or be asked these questions. And based off of their responses, they'll receive a score that marks them as more likely to appear, less likely to appear, more of a threat to public safety. And the questions in this tool will ask about their criminal history, their employment history, history of drug abuse, length at current residence, and a whole host of other factors. Risk assessments in and of themselves are as you can imagine, for different people, have very, very different positions on them because a lot of these things can bake in racial inequity into the assessment. So I think someone might have mentioned how diversion criteria earlier, maybe Rubina, you were mentioning that can be a place where it bakes in inequity. If the assessment tools are in and of themselves based off of criminal history, and criminal history is in and of itself based off of racial disparity, then what are these tools then recommending to, say, judges? And so if we want to go to the next slide. So here again, it's the prosecutor makes a recommendation, the defense attorney does have an opportunity to respond, and then judges make the final decision. And we wanted to talk about prosecutors' role here because we think it's really important to note that what prosecutors say about bail has just tons of influence. Studies show that judges agree with prosecutors 90% of the time. We also want to note here that judges themselves are often former prosecutors and are folks who just have connections to a lot of other system stakeholders. So judges are also an elected position and say in their election campaigns might be taking money from police associations. So these are just sort of the dynamics of who is often judges and different factors that might be coming into consideration.
Yeah, and I would just add in terms of any other actors that could be present at arraignments or when the bail decision is being made. So it is possible for police to attend, especially if it's an open court and it's supposed to be, right? So police officers can technically attend, at least in, I think it's always helpful to have family members there too, of the people who, are, of the people who the judge is making a decision about, especially when they're youth. Sometimes judges will ask parents to come and speak to find out a little bit more information about what's going on. And I also wanted to say that some judges are also appointed, and they can be appointed by certain elected officials. So although some judges are elected, some can be appointed, and it can be very confusing. And New York City is incredibly confusing. So I just recommend people, like, you can check your local counties to see what sort of judges would be up for election, or, if your local criminal judges are appointed or elected.
Thanks, Jack. So here are some of the areas of discretion: who is or is not recommended for release and why. I'm again thinking about, for example, those risk assessment tools. What information is available and considered in that decision? And then what alternatives are recommended to, say, traditional cash bail. And then for other actors, for judges, for example, how does the court decide who can be freely released, who would have to pay bail, and who is not offered bail at all?
So I think here, I also just want to share that in terms of bail, there have been nationwide, sort of legislation or attempts to pass legislation to get rid of cash bail, because the argument is that people shouldn't have to pay for their freedom, right? And so something to just be aware of when thinking about this is that if you're getting rid of cash bail, I'm going to go back a few slides, so give me a moment because I want to show what happens here. If you get rid of cash bail, so there's no cash bond, then the remaining options are direct release, no bond, or release with conditions. So that means that people who might have been able to pay to get out now may have to stay in with no choice. And so this is something that there are, different advocates are concerned about this. And the other option is people can since the court can release with conditions, what's also happening in some places is that more people are getting released with conditions than normally would not get released with conditions, because the apparatus is there and the resources are there to release people with certain conditions. So that means that there can be an increase in the number of people who are being surveilled after a bail decision is made than before. Now, I'm not saying yes or no to cash bail. I'm just sharing that is kind of how some of the trends have gone. So if you get rid of cash bail, that doesn't necessarily mean that racial disparities will change. It could, but it's complicated. So I just wanted to share that in case that was something that folks were interested in, something that we've seen kind of happening across the country. And lastly, in terms of other actors, the question really is, do we want people to be held pre-trial? And that's something that is decided by other people, or can be decided through, changing certain laws or whatever. So the question about cash bail is a question below the larger question of, do we want this system to look the way that it does? So I'm gonna offer a time to breathe. Those are the heaviest ones. The next set of slides, I'm gonna go through a little bit quicker, but it's also stuff where the prosecutor has a little bit less discretion. So we're going to look at discovery. Discovery is also a way to think about it as evidence. So what evidence does the prosecutor have? And what evidence does the prosecutor have to turn over? But I like to draw out, it's not just evidence, right? Because they may use it, they may not use it at trial. They could have certain records that they're not planning on using on trial, but they just have. So the question is, what evidence are prosecutors looking for? What records exist? What do they request? How and when are they provided? Because whatever the prosecutor has, they're supposed to turn it over to the defense attorney. And in certain jurisdictions, there's restraints and rules around what has to get turned over and when it has to get turned over. So we're thinking about, what is it that the prosecutor has in their file? Like, what does their case look like? That information needs to get to the defense attorney, right? And there's a legal obligation to provide that information to the defense attorney within a certain period of time that could be that's defined by statutes, defined by law. And when they're turned over, meaning how many days after somebody is arrested and charged, especially if they're held in, how soon after they hear a bail decision, let's say from the judge, what's going to happen? When are they going to get, when is their attorney going to get the stuff? How long does a person have to stay in jail before they find out how strong of a case the prosecutor has? And that's also a question about information of evidence. So a prosecutor has a legal obligation to provide information that can go towards or support or help or goes towards the innocence of the person who is accused. That is the constitutional right of a person who is accused. But how do you decide what is information of innocence if the person who would be legally obligated to give that over is the same person who's evaluating whether or not it's information of innocence, right? Because the prosecutor is the one with all the information. So we're asking them to evaluate what stuff goes towards somebody's innocence and make sure you provide that, because it's not the judge who sees this information, it's the prosecutor. So other actors that can influence discovery is what sort of records are prosecutors obligated to provide and when, but also what records are they obligated to find? And so there is a question about, and this happened in New York, there's a question about records that go towards the credibility of certain witnesses, especially if that witness is a police officer, right? So there's questions about what if a police officer has a certain disciplinary history or a history of misconduct. Doesn't that, from a layperson's perspective, you would think that that goes towards the strength of the person's case, because what if the person who arrested them and is saying that, let's say they conducted a search of their car and found a gun, like what if that person has a history of misconduct? And that is something that is also determined by state law. So we're gonna breathe and reflect here real quick, because discovery is going to play into our next piece on plea bargains. And this is why I said it kind of goes a little fast, because while the prosecutor is giving over information to the defense attorney, they're also having conversations about the strength of the case, possibly, but also whether or not the prosecutor is going to offer a plea. And a plea means that they're offering for the person to plead guilty to something in exchange for a particular sentence or sentence range. So it's saying, hey, we charged you with robbery in the first degree, but we're going to let you plead to robbery in the second degree. In exchange, you know, as the person who's being accused, what that sentence might be. It will probably be a range according to your state law sentencing guidelines. But prosecutors are not obligated to give a plea bargain. It's their discretion, and judges don't have any power over this besides saying, yes, I accept it, or no, I don't. But again, the judge isn't the one who has the case, who has all the discovery, who has seen the evidence. So again, they often just rely on whatever the prosecutor would say. And so thinking about pleas, especially if somebody especially in a case where bail was set, plea bargains can be, oftentimes people will plead guilty to something because it might be getting them out because they're being held in on bail. So the likelihood of getting a prison sentence or getting a jail sentence if bail was set is actually very high. And we've seen that nationally. So when we think about plea bargains, we want to think about this is really hard. I appreciate that Mordecai shared that out. This is tough because when we think about plea bargains, who's getting offered them? Why are they being offered? When and how are they being offered or changed? because the prosecutor, if they have the power to give you the plea bargain, they also have the power to take it away. And taking away a possible plea bargain or a plea offer, you know, while the defense attorney is figuring out how strong of a case this is, can be really tricky. How are they determined? Like, are plea bargains standard? Is it that everybody who pleads guilty to second-degree robbery is going to get the same sort of offer? Likely not really. They're highly discretionary. And so the other question is, I see Beth's question, why does the plea bargain have to go away if you choose to go to trial to try to prove your innocence? It doesn't necessarily have to go away. That's up to the discretion of the prosecutor, because again, it's up to the prosecutor whether or not a plea bargain is offered or not. So when I was a practicing prosecutor, I always kept my plea bargains open. I wouldn't take it away because I had to prepare for trial, because I viewed it as my job to prepare for trial. Some prosecutors feel that if they're gonna have to prepare for trial, then the plea bargain is off the table because they don't want to do all that work. You know, that's what I've heard in my experience. But to me, if you're willing to plead to a certain thing, then that should just always be the thing. The amount of work I have to do should have nothing to do with it. So, you know, and the questions of accused being held in jail, and then what are collateral consequences to a conviction, or collateral consequences, you know, generally to somebody pleading guilty. The collateral consequences to a conviction, again, are things that are determined by statute, right? These are determined by law. So you can have a law that doesn't create collateral consequences for certain convictions. Unfortunately, state law cannot impact immigration. So if somebody does plead guilty to a certain maybe violent felony, they're very likely to then be facing the possibility of deportation, because DHS would certainly find out about that. But prosecutors also have the power to offer plea bargains that wouldn't trigger immigration, and wouldn't trigger Department of Homeland Security for immigration purposes. And so I would say that Carol Seaman's office does have a policy about trying to include immigration consequences and trying to offer pleas that don't trigger deportation. Different prosecutors have different positions on that. And again, that's highly discretionary. So that's the end for plea bargains. I know that there is a hard stop for Mordecai, so I am going to offer a breath and see if anybody had any questions, and turn it back over to Mordecai.
Jack, this has been an amazing conversation. This has been the presentations, a lot of thought tonight, especially from a community organizing perspective on how we can better support our community in terms of just at those various integral and those various points, what do we need to do as community organizers? And so we want to ask each of you to, how has this conversation impacted you? What are some of your reflections? There will be a follow-up survey as we continue to gather thoughts and build coalition. And if you know other organizations that want to be a part of this conversation, we're going to go deeper into the decision-making areas of prosecution in our subsequent assemblies. And so we want to put the call out to other organizations and individuals who would like to join us and be a sponsor of the Michigan People's Assembly. And so Jack and Sarah and the entire team and our sponsors, we want to thank you all. This has been, I mean, I'm not going to go to sleep tonight. I got a lot to think about. So what I'd like for everyone to do is just to show some love to our team at Vera and just put some hands out, or, I mean, this is a lot of work and a lot of heart that went into this, and we really, really appreciate all of the hard work. We also want to invite everyone, again, if you want to be get involved, please go over and check out the BREATHE Act. We're crafting the Michigan BREATHE Act that really addresses this aspect of prosecutorial reform. And also for our Liberation Pack as well, we put up the QR code earlier. And so Sarah is with us, Sarah Ghetto and Angela. Would you all like to have any closing remarks and comments? We want to make sure we end on time. Any other closing comments? So I'd like to hear from at least one person. You got about 30 seconds. How has this conversation impacted you? Beth, I know I can call on you or Trevor. I don't want to call on you, but I bet you look right at your screen. So Beth, let's come on, let's just have a party tonight.
For me, it's really just understanding the power and the scope of the power that the prosecutor has, and recognizing it as another point that we can really apply pressure. A lot of grassroots activism is around finding those points where you can apply pressure and where people are going to be afraid of losing their job or afraid of losing their influence. And it makes me feel a little bit hopeful to know that this is one of those places that we can have a big impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One immediate takeaway is that we're going to share the recording. Obviously, we're going to ask you to share this recording, to your concentric circles of influence, share this and walk through the data and have conversations. And let's be ready to lean in for part 2 as we go deeper. And so, Angela, would you like to have any closing comments?
Oh, I just put them in the chat so that we could end. It's 8 o'clock. Just thank you, so much gratitude. And then I look forward to seeing you for future presentations as we continue this conversation. And as Sarah linked into the chat, to really think about what prosecutorial justice looks like for Michigan in the context of a broader, more comprehensive civil rights legislation called the Michigan Breathe Act. More to come.
Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon.